Today in this 2012 Ford F350, we'll be having a look at and showing you how to install the Airlift LoadLifter 7500 XL air helper springs, part number AL57596. Now here's what our airbags look like installed. These airbags are a great solution for those of you who are towing a heavy trailer such as a gooseneck or a fifth wheel, or even a standard trailer with a high tongue weight, or are carrying a large amount of weight in the bed of your truck. This will allow you to maintain your factory ride height and have your braking and steering ability be the same as if you didn't have a heavy load in the bed of your truck. This will allow your front brakes to work better and maintain your steering and handling abilities. That way you don't have to worry about having poor control of your truck because you don't have the proper amount of weight over the front axle. These airbags will help support up to 7,500 pounds of weight. They're not going to increase your gross vehicle weight rating by 7,500 pounds of weight. These airbags can be inflated anywhere between 5 and 100 psi of air pressure to meet your needs appropriately for the amount of weight that you're towing or carrying in the truck. Now, when compared to other airbag solutions on the market, such as the Airlift 5000 air helper springs, these have an additional 2,500 pounds of load leveling support, and our airbags themselves are 7 inches in diameter compared to those that are 6 inches in diameter. Now, because these are an inch in diameter bigger than the 5000 Airlift springs, these give us more volume, which will allow us to support more weight. Here we are at our truck. We're going to get a couple measurements to get a baseline to see where our truck is at factory ride height with no weight in the bed of the truck. We'll measure through the center of our wheel and tire assembly to the top of our wheel arch. We're about 43.5 inches. Okay, in the front we're about 40.5 inches. We'll jot these measurements down so we can compare them to when we have a heavy load in the truck. Now we have a little bit over 1,200 pounds of weight in the bed of our truck to simulate a heavy load or towing a heavy trailer. And we're going to compare our measurements to see what our ride height is now. In the back we're about 41.5 inches now. And in the front we're about 41 inches. So with the back of our truck going down and the front end coming up, a couple things are going on. Number one, we'll have less weight on our front axle. With less weight on our front axle, we're not going to have the best steering and braking ability as we did with no weight and letting the factory suspension and brakes do their job properly. This is also going to cause increased tire wear on the outside of our tires because as our front end comes up, we get what's called positive camber and we get more wear on the outside edge, giving us more handling issues, more tire wear, and less braking ability. Our headlight angle also changes as well. Instead of our headlights being aimed properly out the road in front of us, they are now going up towards the trees and can potentially blind oncoming drivers. Now that we have our airbags installed, we have our weight back in the bed of our truck, and we're going to double check our measurements and see where they compare to the factory ride height with the vehicle unloaded. Okay, we're at 43.5 at the rear, which is exactly where it was unloaded with the factory suspension. Okay, we're at 40.5 inches in the front, which is the same measurement unloaded with the factory suspension. So what this means with our vehicle being back at factory ride height and without the back end sagging and the front end coming up, we're going to have our steering, our handling, and our braking characteristics more like the truck being stock without a load in it. So this is going to make us have a safer and a smoother ride as we're going down the road. We're also not going to have to worry about our headlight angle being off, aiming towards the trees, and potentially blinding oncoming drivers. And now we'll take our airbags out on our test course. On the left side of the screen, you'll notice the vehicle without the airbags installed, and on the right side of the screen, you'll notice the vehicle with the airbags installed. In the first part of our test course, we'll be doing some evasive maneuvering, doing some quick turns side to side. You'll notice how unstable and unsettled the suspension is without the airbags installed, and with them installed, you'll notice how much more settled and more control that we have over the vehicle. There is a significant amount less body roll than what we had without them. On the next part of our test course, we'll be going over some bumps, and you'll notice without the airbags installed how much suspension travel we don't have. The suspension can't do its job properly because it's sagging down and doesn't have the amount of travel that it needs in order to help absorb the bumps. with the airbags installed, you can see how much less jouncing and jarring there is going on. It's because the suspension is able to do its job properly with having the weight being supported by the airbags. This will give us much more handling and braking ability with the airbags installed, giving us the safety that we need when we're towing a heavy load or have a lot of weight in the back of our vehicle. Now that we've gone over some features of the airbags, we'll show you how to get them installed. To begin our install, we'll need to position our vehicle in such a way that we can take some of the weight off the rear suspension. We're using a pole jack to do this. You can use a floor jack or jack stands, whatever you have that you can make it work. Now we need to remove our factory bump stops. In order to do that, there's a 15mm nut on the top. It's beneficial to use some spray lubricant on that nut to help loosen up any rust that may exist. You may find yourselves needing to use a pair of large pliers to hold the bump stop still after a while, because it'll start to rotate as you remove the nut. I already have ours mostly loose, but I'll show you the process of removing it. There's a stud on the top of it here that holds it in the frame, and once you remove the nut enough that the stud pops out of the frame, you'll find it start to rotate and you may need to grab it with pliers. Now in our particular case, we're doing this on a diesel truck that has a factory fifth wheel hitch. If yours is a gas engine, or you don't have a factory fifth wheel hitch or have an aftermarket fifth wheel hitch, your hardware will vary slightly on the driver's side. We need to unclip this wiring harness from our frame in order to gain access. There's another spot here. As we unclip all the wiring harnesses, we will have access to where our hardware will go through the frame. Now we'll take our driver's side upper bracket. We're going to bolt it in place through this hole right here in our frame using this hole in the bracket. We'll take our metric bolt and our metric washer, go through that hole. Where the bolt comes through our frame, we'll place on another washer and our nylon lock nut. Let's leave this loose for right now. And here's what it looks like with it in place. Right here where the slot is, you can see my finger coming through this hole. We're going to place our other hardware in place. We'll have an 1.5 inch long 1/2 inch bolt and a washer, and they'll go through the bracket and the hole in our frame. Okay, where the bolt comes through our frame now, we'll place on another 1/2 inch washer, and we'll thread on our flange nut. And here's what the hardware looks like in place. Now we'll start assembling our airbags. Take one of our airbags here, one of our roll plates, place it over so the holes line up. Take one of our airline fittings, we'll screw it in finger tight, and once it's finger tight, we'll take a wrench and tighten it 1.5 turns. There's 1.5. Now we'll take our lower airbag bracket and our axle saddle, set it just like this. Take one of our 5/16 carriage bolts, go through the saddle and our hole. We'll flip it over, place on one of our 5/16 flat washers, and we'll take our 5/16 thin nut, place it on. Then we'll use a 1/2 inch socket and tighten up the nut just enough so it's tight, but yet we can still rotate our saddle bracket. Okay, it's tight, but yet we can still rotate it and slide it side to side. Okay, I've marked a couple spots on our plate where our hardware is going to go through. Our 10-inch long carriage bolts going through this square hole here, our 1-inch long ones going through this square hole here, and these two holes is where our hardware goes through on the opposite end. We'll take our 10-inch long carriage bolt, pass it through, and are 1 inch long. Flip it over. Now we have our airbag flipped over. We'll place on another of our roll plates. We'll grab our bracket. This slot here will face opposite of where our airline fitting is, which is on the opposite end here. So it'll go just like this. Make sure this rotates out of the way. We'll place it on top. And we'll secure it with our pan head Allen bolts. Now we can tighten and torque these 2 bolts to the amount specified in the instructions. Now we can rotate our saddle bracket back into this position here, and we'll flip the whole assembly over. Here we have 3 square spots on our driver's side upper bracket to install hardware. These 2 here, we'll get 2 of our 1.25 inch long carriage bolts. And this one will get a 2 inch long carriage bolt. You notice how that one sits inside and will sit flush once it sits on top of our airbag assembly. This raised lip here will go towards our fitting side. Our fitting will go through this large hole here. Then we'll rotate it to our holes line up. Just like that. Now we'll take one of our 3/8 hex bolts, a lock washer, and a flat washer, and we'll bolt this bracket and our roll plate to the top of our airbag assembly. We'll do the same for both holes. We'll tighten these down. Now we'll torque those 2 bolts. We'll be able to find all of our torque specifications in the instructions. Now we'll take our spacer block and we'll slide this over our long carriage bolt. Notice our holes offset. The wider part will face towards the outside of the vehicle. And now we'll take our assembled airbag and get it into position, working around our brake lines and ABS wires. We'll have to squeeze down on the airbag assembly in order to get it in position. And then as we squeeze down on it, we'll be able to line up our holes in the upper bracket with our carriage bolts. You can see where our bolts went through our upper bracket now, and where our long carriage bolt went through the frame where the bump stop went through originally. And now the carriage bolt that goes through the hole in the frame where our bump stop was, we'll place on our flange nut. That on, we'll now tighten the bolt. Now for our short carriage bolts like this one, we'll place on a flat washer and a nylon lock nut. Now we'll tighten down our nylon lock nuts. Now we'll torque our hardware. Now we'll tighten our hardware that goes in horizontally that holds our upper bracket to our frame. We'll make sure we torque the hardware as well. And now we pushed our lower bracket as far against the leaf spring and our U-bolts as it'll go, making sure our factory U-bolts go inside of our bracket. Now we'll take our new U-bolt, wrap it around our leaf spring and our axle here, making sure it goes through the upper hole on each side. Place on a washer and a nylon nut on both sides of our U-bolt. Now we will tighten down our nylon lock nuts just enough to hold our lower bracket tight up against our axle and leaf spring stack for right now. Now we will install our remaining 10-inch long carriage bolt through this square hole here. Now we'll take our lower axle strap, place our long carriage bolts through it. We'll install a flat washer and a nylon lock nut on each end of our carriage bolt. And now we'll start to tighten those nuts down evenly, working our way one at a time across until it starts to touch our axle. Now we'll torque our axle strap to the amount specified in the instructions. And now we will torque our U-bolt evenly. And now that we have our driver's side airbag assembly in place, we will do the same process for the passenger side. Now we'll use our zip tie that comes with the kit to secure our brake hoses and our ABS wires together and to help pull them away from our airbag. With our zip tie secure, we'll cut off the excess. Now we need to work on relocating the parking brake cable on our driver's side frame rail. We have a 13mm bolt right here that holds our cable in place right in front of our tire. We'll remove this bolt. And we'll pull the bracket down and away. This is our relocation bracket. We'll use the factory bolt and go in this hole here. This spot will go into the frame. We'll slide our factory hanger into the lower two holes. Take one of our bolts and a washer. We'll go through it. And on the other end of the bolt, we'll have a flat washer and a nylon lock nut. And we'll tighten that down now. Here's what it looks like once it's installed. We have one more to do. Just behind the forward end of our leaf spring hanger, we have this lower bolt right here. It's a 13mm to remove. This is our relocation bracket. We'll slide this into the large hole in the frame and use the factory bolt to secure it. Now we'll take the factory bracket and install it into our relocation bracket. We'll take a bolt and a washer, go through the factory bracket and into the relocation bracket. And on the back side, we'll have another flat washer and a nylon lock nut. Now we'll tighten down our hardware. And that's what it looks like when it's installed. Now with our short carriage bolt that's left hanging down on our driver's side bottom plate, we'll install our clamp to relocate our parking brake cable further away from our airbag. We'll make sure that it faces down. And we'll secure that in place with a flat washer and a nylon lock nut. And we'll snug that down. Okay, now we need to find a place to mount our inflation valves. We're going to put ours behind our fuel door here. This is a typical spot you'll find them on a lot of trucks. We have a nice spot over here on the side that won't interfere when we need to add a diesel exhaust fluid or diesel fuel itself. We'll drill a small pilot hole in that area. Now we'll enlarge our pilot hole to 5/16 inch in diameter. You have a couple different options here. You can have just one hole and only one inflation valve to fill up both airbags simultaneously, or if you wanted to fill up each side one at a time, so if you have a heavier load on one side of the truck, you could accomplish that by having one valve to run higher air pressure on one side or lower air pressure on the other. But we're going to be installing a compressor later that's a single stage compressor, meaning that it airs up both airbags simultaneously to an equal amount. So we're only going to need one fitting. We'll start by threading a nut onto our fitting. We'll run it down most of the way. Place on a star washer. Then we'll reach behind our bedside and run the fitting through the hole facing out. Now we'll place on a rubber washer. You may need to thread it on the fitting just so you don't push it through the hole. Then we'll place on a flat washer and we'll thread on another nut. Now we'll tighten down our nut a little bit. You'll need to have someone on the back side reaching up behind the bedside to hold the nut still as you tighten the nut that goes to the gas door. And once it's sufficiently tight, your rubber washer will start to flatten out. And that's a nice solid fitting, so we don't have to worry about it coming loose.
We went ahead and routed our airline tubing back towards our airbags, following the lines for our diesel exhaust fluid filler neck, and have it secured to that with a couple zip ties. The line then goes over our fuel tank and our diesel exhaust fluid tank, goes through our bracket for our brake lines, and then through the actual upper bracket for our airbags. Now we use an airline tubing cutter, which you can get on our website as part number AL10530, and we'll make a nice square cut off of the excess. This is our airline fitting here. We need to install our airline into that fitting. I'm going to have to rotate this fitting 180 degrees. It's a swivel fitting, just so we'll be able to get our airline into it without kinking. And here's what it looks like connected. In order to make your connection, all you have to do is push the airline tubing into the fitting all the way and pull back to make sure it's secure. Now, since we are going to be using a compressor system and only having one airline fitting to air up both of our airbags, we'll need to install our T-fitting. This comes with a particular compressor that we're going to be installing, but if you are not going to be installing a compressor and just want to have one valve, you can pick up this T-union fitting on our website as part number AL21838. So we'll take our airline tubing and we'll cut it in the middle, making sure we have a nice clean cut, and we'll install our fitting in between our cuts. Now it's the same type of fitting as on top of our airbag. You just push until it goes in all the way and then pull back to make sure it's secure. Now we'll take our leftover airline and plug it into the T section of the union, and we'll route this over towards our passenger side airbag assembly, making sure we avoid any moving parts and sources of heat such as the exhaust. Our airline tubing, we went underneath the factory fifth wheel and gooseneck hitch, brought it forward a little bit to our front cross member here in our frame, just to help get some more distance between our exhaust. It's secured with one of our zip ties to the cross member through an existing hole. It then goes inside of our frame channel, goes behind our shock mount, comes down and through our upper bracket for our airbag on the passenger side. Now we're going to measure off how much of our tubing we're going to need to connect to our fitting. And we'll take our airline and push it inside of our fitting and pull back to make sure it's secure. And here's what it looks like once we have it connected. This is our exhaust heat shield. This will go between our passenger side airbag assembly and our exhaust resonator. At the closest point, this will help provide us more protection from the heat of the exhaust and not damage our airbag. We bent ours accordingly so it will fit and we can install our clamps around it. Now we have 4 clamps that will secure it in place. We'll need to take one of our smaller ones and one of our larger ones. We'll combine them so they'll be able to clamp around our resonator. We'll repeat the same process for the other 2 hose clamps. And with our heat shield in position, we'll now secure it into place using our clamps that we combined. Alright, that one's retracted all the way, so now we will rotate it and do the same for that one.
You will need to tighten both hose clamps that you combine in order to shrink down enough to wrap around the resonator. Okay, with both of our clamps now secure, our heat shield's not going anywhere, and it will protect our airbag from the exhaust. Now we'll add some air to our system and check for leaks. Now we'll spray down all of our connection points with soapy water. We're looking for any bubbles. If we see any bubbles, that will indicate a leak. Small bubbles that is coming from us spraying is fine. If we see large bubbles, we know we have a leak. We'll repeat the same process for all of our fittings. And that completes our look at and installation of the Airlift LoadLifter 7500 XL Air Helper Springs, part number AL57596 on this 2012 Ford F.
Thanks for watching. Click the link in our description below to shop, learn more, or visit us at etrailer.com. And leave us a comment if you have any questions.